Good evening. Welcome to Unity Books Presents. I'm Ellen Davenport. I'm here tonight with Jim Blake. Jim has just written his first book, The Zen Executive, Gems of Wisdom for Enlightened Leadership. Jim is the CEO at Unity World Headquarters at Unity Village, just outside Kansas City, Missouri. In the interest of transparency, which Jim recommends, I was the primary editor on this book. Unity Books published it, and yes, he's our boss, so no pressure. There are spiritual books and business books. The Zen Executive is both. Jim says that spiritual principles and best business practices are really not that different. They just might use different language. So this evening, I'm going to start with my questions for Jim. And if you have questions for him, put them in the chat box anytime, and we'll round them up and ask Jim later. Jim, in this book, you insist it's okay to be spiritual at work, even if you're the CEO, even in the corporate world. I expect people listening tonight want to know how to get away with it and what it looks like. I expect a lot of spiritual people work in secular environments incognito, because I used to be one of them. And leaders especially might not feel safe being their full selves at work, or they don't know how to incorporate their spirituality into business. But in this book, you say it can be done because you've done it. You have worked in big global corporations. Now you're the CEO at Unity World Headquarters, which is a 133-year-old spiritual nonprofit. You were also ordained as a Unity minister last year. Congratulations. So did you write this book more as a spiritual guy or a business guy? Which are you?
Well, that's a good question. Thank you, Ellen. Greetings to everyone. I'm glad to be here. It's my honor to be here, actually. And I would say over time, I have learned that the two are really inseparable. And so I didn't write it from the perspective of a spiritual guy or a business guy. They are merged together somewhat. I would certainly say that it probably came more from my spiritual nature, as I wrote it to be of service and to share some of the experiences I've had in my time as a leader, in hopes to help those that may be individuals serving in a corporate job, as you said, or any job, as well as potential leaders in companies, leaders of churches, leaders of nonprofits. So I think that's where it comes from, a little bit of both, but largely a majority towards my spiritual nature, if you will, from my spiritual nature.
What do you hope they'll get out of it?
Really three things. I think understanding the impact of your personal posture, so your thoughts, your emotional well-being, your physical well-being. So the impact that has on those around you. And as a leader, I would say the same thing, except for you're recognizing the impact that it has on those that you're leading. Because in both cases, I think we take for granted sort of the inside stuff and how that impacts how we show up in the world. And then in the third thing would be just that there is a different way. There's a different way to lead, and there's a different way to be in the work world. And you don't have to, as you mentioned earlier, compartmentalize your spiritual nature when you go to work. Now, you can't blatantly be out proselytizing what you believe, but if your true intention is to just bring your spiritual practice to work, there are a number of ways that you can do that effectively and keep it on the DL so that people aren't judging you as such, as it were.
When we were working on this book, I said to you several times, don't people already know this? I mean, don't they know that it's not effective to yell at their employees, for instance? And you insisted that that actually is news to some people in the business world. And then I read this article that said 1 in 7 employees describe their boss as abusive. And abuse ranges from not giving them credit for their work to just outright insults and ridicule. So have you experienced really bad bosses?
I have indeed. And I would say, beyond just sharing some of these experiences and hoping that it helps people find their way, that was the single biggest driver for me, was I had labored under some really, really tough leaders. And I'll get into a little bit of detail here. When you work for someone that is leading through command and control or fear and intimidation, you spend most of your time at work on edge. And I was in the IT world. And so when you're in the IT world, you're also generally, depending on the position you're in, on call 24/7. So these same bosses had access to me when I was away from the office. And I can honestly tell you, there were times when my phone would ring with some of these bad bosses, and I could literally feel the physical impact. My heart would sink, this big sense of dread would come over, and that's just no way to live. And there are times I come home after a tough day, particularly where I felt I was treated unfairly. I'm cranky. I may lash out at those around me. At the same time, in an emotional state, I'm not making very good decisions. And so I may be asked if I want to go to a party this weekend or if I want to go have dinner with someone. In the state I'm in, I'm going to answer that differently, depending on whether I'm feeling good or whether I'm feeling pretty cranky and antisocial. And so there's a real significance that we have and that leaders have in terms of how they impact their people and how it gets carried beyond just the office. And so that is such an important piece to keep in mind. And because I had labored under some of those really difficult bosses and had felt that way, what I basically committed to myself is I don't want anyone that I ever work with to feel this way. I don't want anyone to ever see my name come up on the phone and have the emotional and physical reaction they're having. I don't want people to carry the stress of whatever happened at work home with them. Now, some people, that's their nature and they're going to do it anyway. But as a leader, I'm going to do my best to make sure no one feels and has those experiences that I had. Because there were times where it lasted a really long time and it really did impact my life in a significant way. And so I want to have the opposite impact, where people leave feeling cared for, uplifted, feel like we actually care for them in a way where we're willing to help develop them in terms of cultural competencies and emotional well-being and self-awareness. And those are the things that I think that you can really do as a leader that will change not only those people's lives, but will change the world in effect, because everywhere they go, they have a ripple effect.
So I want you to tell the story of how you became known as a Zen leader, because it's really where we got the title of the book. Jim tells this story in the book. He'd been at this really tense meeting. He'd used some spiritual practices to keep it from blowing. Well, maybe I should let you tell the story.
Oh, sure. So just what you said, it was a very large customer who had a tremendous impact on our annual revenue, probably one of the largest in the country. And we were at odds with them in terms of the operation of the system and who was at fault in terms of whether it was actually the system or if it was the way the customer was trying to implement and use the system. And so this had boiled to a head. And so everyone had to get on a plane and fly to the center of the country at their headquarters location and get in a boardroom. And some of you may have experienced this, but this was some of the most powerful people in both organizations. And in my role as the director of North American Customer Operations, since I was customer facing and it was our team that was taking in most of this information, I was asked to mediate the meeting. And so, as you said, I used some of the things I learned here: staying peaceful, staying present, nonviolent communications. I didn't let anyone do a direct exchange. I sort of translated what I thought I heard before someone addressed it. And we ended up keeping the meeting relatively civil. In fact, I didn't realize how civil until we were leaving. And so we came to a set of terms and some agreements and some action steps, and we were walking out. We're now proceeding to dinner, and the CEO of the Americas came up next to me and he said, I've never had one of these meetings go like that. I've never had a meeting go like that where it wasn't so intense and didn't erupt into shouting. At least, at minimum, some shouting. And he said, which reminds me, and I've been wanting to share this with you for a while. When I hired you, based on your physical stature, I thought I was getting a linebacker for my business, someone who would come in and take control and really be a commanding presence. And after what I just saw, I feel like I got a Zen Buddhist who doesn't lead that way at all. And he said, no, I'm not trying to, I'm in a way complimenting you. I've just not seen anyone lead that way. And clearly it's effective. And he was just really appreciative of how the rest of the meeting went. So that stuck with me for a long time in terms of, now I will say in the long term, I wasn't a very good fit for that culture because he really did want a linebacker. And although we were successful in that meeting and I was successful in a lot of different ways, he really did prefer the command and control and fear and intimidation leadership style. And so I was the odd man out. And so I sort of became the butt of his jokes on more than one occasion for just that reason, because I wouldn't get overly emotional and I wouldn't lead, shouting and trying to scare people into being motivated.
Well, he'll be sorry when the book is a bestseller. And we probably did not coin the term Zen executive, but how would you define it? The subtitle talks about enlightened leadership. So what is it?
I think it's very similar to what I alluded to earlier. It's someone who realizes how their inner state, and so their own inner work, their mental and emotional well-being shows up, how they show up as a result of that. So someone who's constantly aware of that and working on that so that they show up as their best selves. And then secondly, is aware as a leader of how their leadership can impact everyone on their team and impact their families and their friends and their social circles. I think that is really the key is if you're doing those two things, then you're really giving yourself an opportunity to show up as your best self, and you're giving yourself an opportunity to express as the best leader you can be.
So you were kind of the odd man out in that corporate job, but now you're a CEO.
Yep.
So you can do things the way you want. Do you train other leaders in this? I know you've consciously worked on the culture at Unity.
Sure. You can train leaders on some aspects of it. Training and book clubs, there's lots of books we've read together as leadership teams. What I'll tell you is, just like everything else in the world, every person has their own individual expression of how these principles outpicture, how these gems, if you will, outpicture. And so certainly I think everyone, at least in this experience, gets the energy and the substance behind what we're trying to do, and how it outpictures for them is uniquely theirs. And that's the real beauty of it. The thing that's different is it's consistent in terms of empathy and compassion and understanding what we're trying to create as an experience for our associates here. How that outpictures, it really doesn't matter, just everyone is on that same picture and focused on that particular outcome. In other organizations, that's where the falter occurs, is I build this great culture and I'm very supportive of the associates. We do all of these things to create a real family-like atmosphere. But then depending on which division you work in, you may have different leadership philosophies. So you have a servant leader over here and his team is thrilled. I mean, they're happy and feel supported and cared for. And then over in this quadrant, you have someone who's under someone who leads through fear and intimidation. Same beautiful culture, two completely different experiences of the culture. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned servant leadership. How do you define that?
It really is just what it implies, but and I'll be somewhat brief here. The easiest way to describe it is your job as a leader is to support those that you're leading, and so I simplify that into making sure they have the tools, the resources, and an environment where they can successfully do their job. If any of those three components is missing, they're going to struggle. And so your role is to provide those things and then be, I like to call it, the obstacle remover. So they're going to come to you and say, I'm having this challenge, and it's your job to figure out how to help them with that challenge. And so it's really that. It's really being a supportive presence and being supportive in all those areas that I mentioned.
We're already getting some great questions, and this one from our friend Barbara Fields fits right into what we're talking about. So let me go ahead and ask it.
Yeah.
She says, are the principles we're discussing here really spiritual? Or could we say they are trainings from conflict resolution, nonviolent communication, and other resources from secular social sciences?
I think it's all of the above. I think there is wisdom in each and every one of those things. And I also believe in a lot of cases, they're very similar. So some of the things we talk about as spiritual principles show up in some of those other areas. And so one could argue that they're not spiritual principles at all. Others could argue that they fit very well into a particular set of spiritual teachings and are found in some of some of the most popular faith traditions in the world. So I think it's a little bit of all of that, actually.
Maybe it just depends on where you first learned it.
Exactly.
It surprised me when I first read the book how much you emphasized self-care as a business practice.
Yep.
You say it's crucial to job performance.
Yep.
So talk about why that's so important.
So again, this is part of the uniqueness of my IT background. As an IT person in technology, as I mentioned, you're on call a lot, but you also work a lot, especially early in your career when you're lower down the totem pole. We did a lot of overnight stuff, a lot of late at night stuff, system modifications, system maintenance, upgrades, and so forth. And I learned very quickly how I was not able to function very well the next day, just from lack of sleep. And so over time, I started to learn all these little things and how they began to impact me in terms of my decision making and my performance. And so as leaders, we want to be at our best. And this goes again to your sort of emotional posture. It's not just about taking care of yourself, but it's also understanding and having an awareness of where you are in the moment. So if you come into the office and you're really frustrated because you had a flat tire and you're shaken up and it's thrown your whole day off and you're angry, and someone comes in immediately and says, hey, we've got this big decision to make right now. The client's waiting and we need to know what we want to do here. In that moment, depending on what your emotional state is, you may make a different decision. Whether you're centered and feeling at the top of your game, or whether you're angry and frustrated. And we've all, I think, I can confidently say, we've all made decisions out of anger or frustration or some sort of emotion. And many of us would agree, maybe not our best decision. And so part of the self-care piece is understanding that, understanding your inner state, as well as your emotional state, but more importantly, the little things. So think about a professional athlete. They are paid to do their work. And so many of them that are paid to do these, paid for their profession, spend a lot of time on how they enhance their performance, both physically and mentally. They've got coaches, they've got vision, people who can teach them how to do proper visioning of their performance. They've got food folks, they've got doctors. The point is, they make their physical and mental and emotional health a priority so that they can perform at the highest level physically. It's the same for us. We just don't look at it that way. If we want to be the highest performers we can, we have to get enough sleep. We have to stay hydrated. We have to eat proper foods. If you're eating all processed and sugar foods, that takes a toll on you physically. You can actually feel a difference. And so it's all of those little things that can add up to clouded judgment, not being at the top of your game from a mental and emotional perspective. Can I answer your question?
Yeah, but so we have 160 people out there, and I can hear them saying, I don't have time for that, especially if they're in one of those jobs like you had, where you're expected to be on call 24 hours a day.
Yeah. So I can try to give a couple of examples, but I'll go this route. If you're stressed out and you're tired, it's more likely that you're going to become more stressed out, right? So now you're tired and stressed. So now they're starting to pile up. And you haven't eaten, so you've got brain fog because you haven't eaten all day. So now I'm creating this avalanche of things that I could have avoided by simply taking these steps. And so what I guess I would say is, you have to make time for these. You don't have time not to do these things, because if you're truly wanting to be at peak performance, or at least a centered state of performance, You have to do these things. And the way it outpictures, believe it or not, when you're well rested, when you're hydrated, when you're eating good foods, when you're exercising, when you're doing all the basic things that everyone's like, oh, yeah, I don't want to hear about it, you're basically able to handle the stress and anything else that shows up in a much more profound way, much more efficiently. It doesn't rock you. It doesn't shake you. You're able to make clear and decisive decisions. And so I think all of those things that we talk about, if you're not doing them now and you begin to do them, you will experience the difference. And once you experience the difference, you won't want to go back. You'll really begin to notice when you're doing a majority of those things, how good you feel, how productive you are, how easy you're able to navigate the flow of life, as opposed to when you're not doing those things. Because all those things I talked about begin to compound, and it just gets worse and worse.
Yeah. You also urged leaders to do their inner work. And this was challenging, to get over their insecurities, to tame the critical voice within, to recognize that their perceptions may not be reality. I haven't worked for any really bad bosses, but I've worked for some that I did not think were terribly self-reflective. So how do you get them to see the importance of inner work?
I don't know that you can going upward. Meaning if you have a boss who's not, and you're going to try to suggest these things to them, given the fact that they're already not very self-reflective and insecure, you're probably not going to be very successful. A good way to do it is to lead by example. A good way to do it is to suggest some things for the team, okay, your peers and those on your team, where the boss can participate. That is a way that I have had some success in exposing leaders to some of these things. Hey, I really want to do this for my team. Be happy to have you join, or have any of your folks join. And so that's a really easy way to sort of get it on the ground wherever you are, and then be able to fold some people in without going to them directly.
Okay. I hope they're listening. You are a guy who loves facts and data. You always want us to bring you facts and data in order to make decisions, but you're also really intuitive. And in the book, you say you did not start out that way.
Yeah, in fact, I thought intuition, I thought that was a gift reserved for mediums and psychics. I in no way thought I was worthy of such a thing, and nor did I think I would have that ability. But over time, I began to really understand what that was. And it was largely through my practice of meditation that this became clear to me. I started getting clarity on things that I was confounded by, either in the meditation or at the end of meditation or a little bit later. And so the more I meditated, the more I began to, and when I say more, not length, I didn't meditate for hours and hours and hours. The more consistently I did it, just a few minutes each day, committed to it daily, the more this sort of intuitive gift began to develop. Coincidences would happen. People would show up with information before I needed it. I didn't know I needed it, but then I had it. And it really became this extraordinarily useful tool in decision making. And so I began to study it. The more those things happened, the more I wanted to understand more about it. So I began to read a lot on intuition. And it's different for everyone. Some people see it. So they see something in their head when they're getting an intuitive hit. Other people have a feeling in their heart or in their gut. Some people see it it shows up in pictures for them. And so every person has the gift of intuition, and it doesn't take a ton of work to develop it, but it does take some consistency and some practice. And over time, you will begin to learn what yours is, where it comes from. And so now I've arrived at a place where I know exactly what the physical feeling is and where I feel it in my body when I have an intuitive hit, and I can go there. Darn, if I'm at the grocery store struggling with which brand of toothpaste, I can sort of just pause for a minute and feel which one might be best suited for me, and make decisions even that way, little things like that. But it took me a long, long time to get there, and I will say, early on, I didn't believe it, and I didn't believe I had it. And but I'm here to tell you, you all have it. You can all develop it, and it is extraordinarily useful in your decision making and in guiding your way through life's ups and downs.
Well, you mentioned meditation, and I wanted to ask you about that too. Is meditation how you get to intuition?
Some people don't have to. Some people, directly access it. It's there. It's been with them for a really long time. For me, that's what worked. I do believe this. Whether you actually are doing meditation or your meditation takes other forms. So other people can get to the same place that meditation takes me by doing their artwork, or by going on a nature walk, or by sitting in nature. Some people get it while reading. It's really finding what that practice is that sort of centers you. And I think if you're doing that consistency, because what you're doing is you're then quieting the mind, and you're quieting this angst that sometimes we all get into, and you're allowing everything to settle, and you're creating space for intuition to emerge. If you're chattering all the time in your mind and worried and fearful and all of that stuff, there's no room for intuition to come up and reach you. You've all had aha moments, so I know you've all experienced them at one time or another. A practice of finding that center, whatever that is for you, yoga, walking, artwork, that creates the space for that internal wisdom to emerge. And so I would just say, whatever that is for you, find that. And yes, I do think that creates an opening to help develop your intuition more regularly.
Well, and in the book, you just really insist that people should be meditating.
I do. But the caveat I have, and what I'll say here, is what I just said. That looks different for everybody.
Yeah.
What is your meditation practice looks completely different. How long you meditate. Here's the thing. I'm a researcher guy. So when I wanted to learn how to meditate, I bet I read 17 books on meditation, and they all said something different. And so what I've learned is there's no right way to meditate. There are forms, there are methods, but what really is important is what works for you. And that may be 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, maybe it's a 30-minute. Whatever that practice is for whatever length of time, it's really what works for you is the most important thing. So don't be intimidated by, I don't know how to do it. I don't have 30 minutes to spare. When I started for 3 minutes. I literally downloaded a meditation timer and would only do 3 minutes. And then slowly but surely, I started to catch myself going past the timer. And now I spend about, I'm going to say 15 to 20 minutes every single morning in meditation. And there are other places in my day where I will sort of reach a state of meditation. So I'll go work out, and if I'm stretching, I can sort of reach a place where I'm sort of meditating while I'm stretching. So you begin to incorporate it into a lot of things. Some people say they meditate while they're driving. I'm not sure how that works, but I believe that you can get there, certainly with the right music and the right mood. I'm sure they feel like it's a meditative state. So, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about some business practices. You've got a whole section on mission and value statements, and corporations have them, churches have them. I always think of them as edited by committee. But why are they important, and how are they spiritual?
Well, so let's start with mission statement, because I think it's the simplest to understand in terms of what we've all at some point probably run across this idea of an affirmation. If we want to change our behavior or change our belief in something, we will write down an affirmation and we say it to ourselves over and over and over again. Some people use them to sell their houses. People use them to change behavior, as I mentioned. A mission statement, if you really think about it, can become an affirmation. It can become an affirmation for an organization, and not necessarily an affirmation of what you want to become. So not aspirational, but of really who you are and what you want to be in the world. Why are you there? And if it's short and compelling, it even becomes more powerful, because now you've got an affirmation, a collective affirmation that you and everyone on your team is basically constantly affirming through your mission statement. And because it's short and compelling, it's meaningful. People are able to remember it, and it begins to drive your decision making. And in many cases, when you have a compelling mission statement that really sticks with people, they'll go back to it before they make major decisions. Hey, does this line up with our mission? Hey, does this fit in our mission? And so when we talk about a mission statement being spiritual, I'm talking about sort of the spiritual practice or principle of affirmations and a collective affirmation, where energy flows where we put our intention. And so the more we focus on that collective affirmation, the more of our energy, mental and emotional, goes there, as well as those of our associates. Value statements are a little bit different. Sort of the same thing, but it's more of a collective agreement for how we're going to treat each other, how we're going to show up with each other, with our clients, with our customers. And I used to not be a big fan of values. But I found in that building a healthy culture, they're really important, especially if you build them into the performance management system that monitors the culture. So not only are you good at your job, but you're also adhering to these values that we've collectively established together, these rules for how we're going to show up with one another. And the reason I think that is so compelling is I'm guessing that we have all encountered at one time in our life, I'll just call this person Bob or Charlie. We'll call him Charlie, a cat named Charlie. And Charlie is good at his job, but Charlie is cranky and cantankerous, and everywhere Charlie goes, he leaves this wake of negativity. No one leaves an interaction with Charlie feeling good about the interaction, about themselves. But for decades, companies just were okay with that. And they said, well, Charlie's good at his job, so we have no reason to terminate him, and you'll get used to it. It's just Charlie, you'll get used to it. And in a really healthy culture, your highly functioning, self-aware people that are there being good corporate citizens shouldn't be subjected to that. It's not helpful, and it's not healthy for them, and it's not healthy for the organization. And so when you tie these really well thought out and agreed upon values to the performance management system, now you're holding people accountable not only for their work product, but how they behave in the workplace. And everyone can feel safe and secure that they'll be treated with respect and dignity, and no one will have to put up with the likes of Charlie. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and at Unity, our evaluations take those values into account, as well as just plain old job performance. You've got a motto, mantra, affirmation: change is our friend, or make change your friend. I know you've run into some resistance to that idea. How have you convinced people to make change their friend?
Well, in some cases, it takes a lot of time. This all started when I began to realize my own resistance to change, and that my own emotional suffering was caused by my resistance to change. And then here's the part that really sort of made me wake up. You hear this all the time. The only constant in the universe is change, which is absolutely true. Everything in the outer world changes. Nothing stays the same forever. And yet we expect nothing to change. And so we're sort of setting ourselves up for disappointment right out of the gate. And so part of making change our friend is understanding that change is going to happen, and just really the mantra, and the reason I use it so much, and I have used it as an affirmation with teams over and over again, is to help people sort of be okay with the idea that change is okay, and that you're still going to be safe and everything's going to be okay. And especially in organizations where I've been asked to go in and turn things around, which has been a handful of times, you want to be able to help people get to a place where they can embrace and expect change. And initially they laugh it off, but over time, it works. The more you affirm it and the more you talk about, we're going to make a lot of changes, make change your friend, the more they begin to let down their defenses and let down their guard and be open to the idea that change is going to occur. Over time, it even became a joke. I mean, there was one organization where we had done so much change and said it so much that would be their stand. I know, Jim, change is our friend. Yeah, we got it. And so it really, really helps, as I mentioned, to sort of open everyone to the idea that change is not only coming, but it can be a really good thing. And if it doesn't work, then we can talk about this a little bit later. If it doesn't work or it fails, you just change again. But it's really just getting used to the idea that not only in a business and in what we're trying to do with our work, but in the world, change is going to be a constant. If I really want to reduce my own mental and emotional suffering, I probably need to get used to that idea.
So have you converted any teams to the idea that change is not so bad?
Many. But proof is in the pudding, and it's all about success. And so when you make changes that are successful and that really connect with people and help them do their jobs better and more efficiently and have a better outcome than they were experiencing before, it becomes so much easier. So a handful of low-hanging fruit, early wins right off the bat make a really, really big difference in creating momentum towards going forward with a lot of change and helping people accept it.
Well, and everyone who's a leader, actually everyone, has been through change with this pandemic. And we got a comment in the chat from Michael, who is an employee, who says the idea of embracing change got Unity through the pandemic in an admirable way. So would you talk a little bit about how you handled COVID?
Sure. I will say the most important thing was over communication and complete transparency. Those were the two most important elements in terms of how we handled it with the group. The third most important element from a leadership perspective was, and this was really, really difficult, but it was a lot of time spent going through every possible scenario. So we were all basically at the mercy of what our counties were doing, what our cities were doing, how serious this was going to be versus how minimal it could be. And so there was no long-term decision making that could be done. And so as a leadership team, we spent a lot of time locked in a room saying, okay, if the CDC says this, we'll do this. If the county says this, we'll do this. Here are some things we just need to do no matter what the decision is. And we did all of this scenario planning so that as things unfolded before us in the coming days and weeks, we had talked about possible scenarios for execution and prepared ourselves for that. All the while, we communicated everything to everyone we served with. We made it clear that they were our first priority, and we demonstrated that through putting people in a position where they felt safe and could work from home and do things of that nature. When we didn't know, we were transparent about the fact that we didn't know. And as soon as we did know, we communicated that. So I would say those are the 3 or 4 major things that we did in terms of from a leadership perspective, and then really making sure that the people understood that we were putting them first, and how they became to understand that was through the actions that we took to support them and make them feel safe and comfortable.
You were really forthright in the book about the possibility of failure in business. Isn't that something we all want to avoid?
Certainly. I mean, no one wants to fail, but I think that for too much time, too many decades, there was an overemphasis on a failure and how that was tied back to a person or an organization or a division. Any sort of failure at all was unacceptable, and the person in charge of it became labeled a failure, and maybe the department became labeled a failure. And so it was this really big thing. No matter how small the initiative was, failure was this boat anchor that was then attached to you and the person and maybe the department for a really long time. And fortunately for a lot of us, in the late 90s, early 2000s, this really began in Silicon Valley. This movement began to come forth that made failure okay. And it was in the vein of all the startup companies, right? So something would emerge as a trend, and a startup company would start up quickly to try to take advantage of that trend or capitalize on that trend. And in some cases they would fail, and in some cases they'd be wildly successful. But out of that emerged terms like serial entrepreneur. I don't know if you've heard that term, but You used to just have entrepreneurs. Now you have serial entrepreneurs. These are folks that start company after company after company. Maybe over half of them fail and only a handful of them are successful. But they don't let failure get in the way. And it really sort of opened the door for people it gave people permission to fail and not become a failure. It gave companies the opportunity to fail at something and not be labeled a failure. And so then books and articles were written on how to fail fast and how to fail frequently and how to recover. And in the end, what we ended up with was this sort of broader acceptance of, with innovation comes risk, and with risk comes the possibility of failure. But it's okay. Learn what you can from it and keep moving. And so then we were given many examples of iterations of people and companies that at first failed and then went on to be wildly successful. Michael Jordan's of the world, Oprah Winfrey, even Einstein was shunned as a young man, said he wouldn't amount to much. All of those folks, Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team. Oprah had tried a million times to get to where she is today and didn't get much support or have much success early on. So I think we're at a place now, at least in most cases, where it's okay. Just because one fails does not mean they are a failure. And if you can adopt that attitude, I think you'll go a long way to being able to say, okay, this didn't work. What can I learn from it? And what's the next iteration?
I want to ask you one more thing, and then we'll switch to the listeners' questions because they're as good or better than my questions. But you read about leaders going through tough times personally who have to keep showing up at work. In my newspaper days, the managing editor got a divorce one year, and 5 people got fired that year, which was about 5 times more than usual. He was really hard to be around. So how can a leader handle grief or loss or personal upheaval and keep working?
Yeah, so I think, and look, this is a really, really difficult subject, and I don't know that there is a right answer, but I do know some things that can help. So when this happens, when something tragic shows up, the first thing we throw out the window is all of the stuff we were doing to take care of ourselves. We stop eating, we stop sleeping, we become stressed, we don't drink water, we're not mindful of our exercise or anything that we were doing to take care of ourselves. We throw all that out the window. And that's honestly the worst decision we can make. This is from my personal experience because I've done all those things I just told you. And what I've learned, unfortunately, I've had probably like many of you, more tragedy in my life than I would care to have had at this point. But what I've learned is during those times, the most important thing I can do for myself is keep doing what I was doing to take care of myself. And in most cases, double down. If I can double down on something, do that. It doesn't make the pain go away. It doesn't make it any easier to get through, but it does put me in a position to do some effective decision making. It puts me in a position to better be able to process my emotions. It puts me in a better position to be able to react from, although a place of pain or sadness, at least I'm centered. I'm not sad, in pain, tired, not eating well, have brain fog, stressed out. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's when it really becomes the most important. That's probably one of the most important things you can do is don't chuck everything else out the window. And then allow yourself the space and time. And here's the other, and this is where transparency comes in. There are many times I've had to go before my team and say, listen, there is something deeply personal that's happening or that has happened, and I'm really struggling. And my invitation to you is that if I'm not showing up in a way that you're accustomed to seeing me, please bring it to my attention. People will support you and help you in that way if they know what's happening. If they don't know what's happening and you're just reactive and not in a good space, they can't support you, they can't help you, and they certainly can't be understanding when things arise.
Yeah. All right, let's switch to the questions because we've got lots of them. Chat's been really active. Angie wants to know, how do you define a leader? Does this apply only to people who are in charge?
And that is a great question. And it's actually one of my favorites. And that's the thing I don't necessarily care for when we begin to talk about these topics. A leader does not mean someone who is in a position of authority with a team or over other people. You can be a leader anywhere you are. You can lead by example, and you can be a leader in your communities and your families, in meetings that are being moderated by someone else. There are so many opportunities for all of us to be leaders and impart these practices. And again, lead by example. How many of you have been inspired by the way you've seen someone handle themselves? Just maybe at the grocery store or in another meeting at the office. So you don't have to have a title to be a leader. So I don't know that I have a specific definition other than to say just that. Anyone, anywhere can be a leader. And I believe we all have that capacity and ability to do so.
Lance says, Jim, thanks for such a timely book. Great job. What are your thoughts about the Great Resignation that's impacting the labor force?
Well, that's an interesting, I'd say it's one of the most interesting developments that we've seen in a very long time. As many of you know, as we all know, the impact of the pandemic, I think, will be showing up for decades to come. And one of the things that was profound, and part of the reason you're seeing this is, and this goes back to leadership, it's what people will begin to tolerate now that they've sort of reset their life priorities. They've reset what they think is important in life versus what they thought was important pre-pandemic. And with these new expectations, I think leaders are challenged more than ever to have that understanding, to understand what is behind the Great Resignation. Is it bad bosses? Is it money? Is it benefits? Is it strictly work from home opportunities? And that'll be different for a lot of organizations. But I think there is a great opportunity for leaders to stop and listen and reflect on any data they can gather from people that are leaving. Why are you leaving? How could we make this different so that maybe you weren't going to leave? And I think there is some impact leaders can have. In other cases, there's just not going to be anything anyone can do. Some people have just decided that this particular line of work is way too stressful for me and I can't do it anymore. And my priorities are different. And look, people had a period of time to slow down for once, be at home, and really become reflective and sit with themselves and begin to understand what was important to them. And so I think it's led to a lot of this decision making around what they will do next. We've seen a lot of early retirements as well, in terms of people deciding that life's too short and they want to enjoy as much of it as they can. So there's a lot to be gained, and I don't think we're done understanding what is going to come out of this, the data and the resources we have around this Great Resignation.
This question from Margaret, I think it came in while we were talking about bad bosses. She said, what does someone do when they aren't belittled, but they're overlooked and considered by others not integral, by not being given opportunities that are given to others?
So this is, in my experience, I've had that happen a lot early in my career. In a lot of cases, I would just leave. Today, what I would say is transparency, going back the other way. I would go and talk to whoever I could talk to, whether it's my supervisor or manager or leader, and say, listen, this is what I'm perceiving. This is how I'm feeling. Is there anything that can be done to change this? And in that conversation, you'll get a lot of information. Number one, this person may not even recognize that's happening. Depending on how many people they're responsible for and what they're doing, they may not even know that that's the experience you are having, and may immediately want to change that experience. In other cases, they may know it's happening and not be willing to do anything. And you have to be willing to accept that feedback as well, and then make a decision based on that. And so I, over time, and believe me, I was conflict averse the whole first part of my career, not only as an associate, but even as a leader. I tried to avoid conflict at all costs. And it's a skill that I really had to learn, presence and practice and develop. But now I believe that that's the most important thing that we can do. And it doesn't always have to be conflict. So I'll rename it to transparency. Transparency, being transparent, and then being willing to be with whatever the outcome of that transparent conversation is. I hope that helps.
So Henry wants to know, Jim, how does a Zen leader start his day?
So for me, I do two things. I work out in the mornings. I'm a morning workout person. If I do it before everyone else gets up, it's out of the way for me, and it doesn't impact anyone else's schedule. And at the end of that workout is my meditation time. And so I accomplish those two things early in my day, and then I feel like I've done two of the most important things. I've done some self-care for my health. I've got myself set right from a spiritual, mental, and emotional space, and now I'm ready to move on with the rest of the day.
So we've been using the term Zen a lot and maybe kind of loosely, but Will and Madeline are asking, how do you think the philosophy and practice of Zen is consonant with Unity teachings? And are there any significant differences between them?
Well, so now I think we're going, like you said, Ellen, probably more into maybe the theological aspects. I'll call it theological principles of Zen. And I think, like you said, this is a loose correlation of the idea of Zen philosophy in terms of how we incorporate that into a leadership philosophy. So generally speaking, you'll find some of the same tenets in Zen Buddhism in Unity. The Fillmore studied Buddhism as well as many other religions, and they believed, well, part of the formation of Unity and the name, the reason that it is called Unity, is because they believed they took some of the world's most ancient and most powerful teachings from all faith traditions and brought them together to create the principles that we now observe in Unity. But primarily, I think the mental aspect and mental approach that you find in Zen Buddhism and Unity are very nearly the same in terms of understanding how your mental and emotional state impact your experience of the world and the things that you can do to modify and change those so that you don't experience so much suffering. I didn't get too specific there, but I think generally that idea of, excuse me, the mental, really paying attention to and being aware of your mental state and how that impacts your experience are very much in alignment with both Unity and Zen.
We're kind of jumping around here, but Richard says, hiring the right person can be difficult in today's world of HR. People know how to interview. Any Zen tips for hiring?
Well, so there's a number of things, and this is where intuition becomes important. You're going to have a resume, and you're going to have the interview that's going to present you with a lot of facts and data. Your intuition will be very helpful in terms of the feeling you can get about a person. There's two other things that I would recommend. The first one is some form of, I don't like to use the word personality test, but behavioral analysis of some kind, whether that's the Effectiveness Institute has one. Lots of people are familiar with the Enneagram. What are some of the others, Ellen, that we've talked about? The DISC, D-I-S-C is one.
Myers-Briggs.
Yeah, Myers-Briggs. That's the
Enneagram.
Yes, thank you. So adding that in, I think people don't traditionally interview their way around those. And so you'll get some good data about at least a person's behavioral style from that. So that's one thing I would incorporate if you possibly can. And then the second thing is there's an interview style called behavioral interviewing. And you'll find any number of articles and books on this, but the emphasis behind behavioral interviewing is basically asking the candidate to tell you about a time when. So if you're looking to find out if someone's resilient, tell me about a time when you had to be resilient and how did that work out? Tell me about a time when you failed and how did you respond to that? But the emphasis behind it is that past behavior is the strongest indicator of future behavior. And so you can base a lot on how a person handled something in the past and what they tell you about that in terms of how they might handle it in the future in your organization. So I think if you can add in those two things, you'll be in a good path to getting at least a lot more information about your candidates. Yes, behavioral interviewing.
Yeah. We do that with ministerial students.
Sorry, I saw the chat, Ellen. That's what I was speaking to. So.
I know, I saw it too. Sharon says, how do you stay inspired so you can keep your team fired up?
Well, I read a lot, and I find a lot of inspiration just from my team. And of course, when you work in a place like Unity Village, there's inspiration all around us. I mean, we are constantly releasing books and materials that are inspirational and very effective in terms of tools and resources. But for me, I read a whole lot. I read a lot in the evenings. I read a lot in the mornings, and I'm always finding some gem or something that uplifts me. And of course, I then share it with those I work with. And so I don't always have to go that route, but meaning, when we're truly developed, we should be able to find inspiration within. And I think certainly that is the case. But I also think that some of these outer tools and resources help bring that up within us and help it come to the surface. And so a lot of reading. In fact, if you were to look at my social media, there's very little around news and those sorts of things. I have purposely followed what I would call inspirational speakers. And so my social media is littered with that. It's littered with memes and quotes and videos and talks. And so I spend a lot of time down that path.
Susan wants to know, what career accomplishment are you most proud of?
Oh, goodness gracious. I don't know that it's a career accomplishment as much as a personal accomplishment, but I was the first person in my family to go to college. I mean, in the entire history of my family. And so I would say that's one thing. But secondly was my master's, was achieving and finally getting my master's of divinity. It was a really, really long journey for me for a lot of reasons that I won't go into. But finally achieving that master's degree is probably one of the things I'm most proud of. That, and of course being ordained about a year ago. But that collection of things, the attainment of a master's degree and the ordination, are pretty profound for me.
Let's switch over to the ministry side of leadership a little bit, because we have some questions on that. This is Steve Colliday. He says, I recall when you walked across the stage to receive your ordination as a Unity minister. And wow, how has that journey been, deciding to become a Unity minister while a CEO? Let me interrupt to say, Steve, the September-October edition of Unity magazine will have a profile of Jim talking about that very thing, how he blends being a minister with being a CEO. But you can answer it now, too.
So the journey has been interesting. I think I talk about this in the book, but for a long time, I identified myself as this corporate guy who was deeply spiritual. And then through this journey, I've sort of really uncovered that I'm just a really deeply spiritual being who has some corporate gifts. And that shifted identity was really transformative for me. And I always knew, and I don't know, I always felt like I wanted the ordination, but I didn't feel like I wanted to be a leader of a church ministry. I didn't feel like that was mine to do or my calling. And so to finally receive it felt like an exclamation point on that transformational journey I just talked about, where I went from believing I was this corporate guy with a deep spiritual practice to becoming sort of accepting myself as this more spiritual being, and that was okay. And so the ordination and the reverend title sort of helped complete that transformation for me and helped me begin to really identify myself in that way. The other thing I would say is it carries quite a bit of responsibility, at least for me. I feel quite a bit of weight and responsibility, even more so than before, to really lead by example and to be really thoughtful in my decision making and to really contemplate how I will handle things going forward, because I now carry that designation. And so it has really centered me in my responsibility, even more so than as just a leader, to lead by example.
So Ann says, I thought Jim got his ordination from another organization. It was ordination from Unity, but MDiv from UFBL. You want to talk about how that came about?
Yeah, it was Johnny Coleman Theological Seminary is where I finished my master's work. So at the time, when I came back with the ultimate goal being ordination, I looked at how I might be able to accomplish that in my role as CEO. And unfortunately, there wasn't a path in the Unity system that had sort of rubrics for measuring how I could, your spiritual development and so forth in terms of achieving that ordination. And so I just took things really slowly and decided I'm going to get the master's first, and then I'll worry about ordination afterwards. And I was really, really impressed with the Johnny Coleman Theological Seminary. I was impressed with the instructors. We had begun to partner with them in many areas. I met the CEO, I met the provost, and I was really, really just impressed with their curriculum and the type of curriculum that they were bringing forth. And as it turns out, they were very friendly in terms of carrying over some of the master's work I had done previously to that. And so it really became sort of this divine event in that I sat next to the provost at a dinner one evening and we began this discussion, and it just evolved from there. But based on my experience with her and some of the other leaders and folks I talked to, I knew that was an experience I wanted to have. And so I finished up there. And then shortly thereafter, Unity had begun to broaden their rubrics and measurements for someone in a capacity like mine, and that all came together as well. And so it worked out perfectly.
You're getting a lot of congratulations in the chat.
Thank you all very, very much. I'm deeply grateful.
Yeah. We have just a couple of minutes left, but since we know we have a lot of ministers listening tonight,
sure.
Sometimes ministers or their boards are reluctant to see church as a business. And so for them, it may be the reverse. They may need to incorporate business practices into a spiritual setting. You have recommendations for that?
I do. So as we know, everything begins in consciousness, right? And in some cases, we need to become conscious about best business practices and how that can transform and or shape an operation. And so, like it or not, there are aspects of we have to achieve some form of revenue to pay the staff and to keep the operation going. And so the idea then is to, from a business perspective, how do we do that? From a prosperity perspective, how do we do that? How do we create a space and a consciousness that allows us to be okay with being prosperous and continuing to be in ministry? I would suggest you connect the two. You're not going to be in ministry for very long if there's not some form of prosperity and revenue that's coming in. In addition to that, business best practices. So this is where that constant, and at one time it was probably a healthy tension between nonprofit and the corporate world, the evil corporate world. The whole reason I'm here is because I wanted to get away from the corporate rat race. But there are institutional best practices that the best companies in the world use. There is no reason in the world we can't incorporate those into nonprofits and or ministries. They're successful for a reason. It doesn't change anything about the work you're doing. It changes absolutely nothing other than it makes you more efficient, and it makes you more attuned to those aspects of the operations. And so I believe that there can be success in both. And I believe if you want to be successful in one, you you must also have the other. That's vice versa as well. I believe that there must be some heart in any business for it to truly be successful in a powerful, meaningful way.
So Amy says, then what's the difference between a CEO and a minister? Is it just where they work?
That is a really, really great question because I can see both sides. I mean, as a CEO, you are somewhat of a minister, at least in the way that I view it from a servant leader perspective. You have to lead. You have to lead those that you're serving with. You have to provide inspiration. And my humble belief, if you're going to be successful, everyone needs to be inspired and aligned towards a same vision, the same goal, the same mission, as I talked about. And so maybe there is little difference. I'd have to think about that some more. But on the spot, I would say they're probably very, very similar, actually. More similar than we care to admit, maybe. Except for maybe in salary. Salaries are some of the big company salaries. I mean.
Yeah, right. Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there for this evening. Jim, thank you so much for taking the time to join all these people. Jim's book is at unitybooks.org/Zen Executive. It's also on Amazon and Kindle. So we hope to see you at the next Unity Books Presents. Thanks for joining us.